Today's daf is daf Tzadi Beis, but we're going to start on Tzadi Aleph Amid Beis to fill in some of the gaps from yesterday. And if you see, the daf Tzadi Aleph Amid Beis is broken down into smaller column and a larger column. So if you count up from the larger column, 3 lines up, it says Toshma. Now, what do we need going forward? We need to know that according to Rabbi Tarfon, you could be misnadev, you can offer voluntarily shemen to the mizbeach, and the shemen will be brought on the mizbeach. Now the Gemara wants to know how much of the shemen is going to be burnt on the mizbeach. So Toshma, we're going to prove from a brisa that according to Rabbi Tarfon, all the oil, the entire volume of oil that he brings, we'll see soon what that volume is, has to be burnt on the mizbeach. Yayin kedivrei Rabbi Akiva. If somebody is misnadev yayin and he brings yayin to the mizbeach, then lisfolim, right? There were bowls on the top of the mizbeach, and the yayin was poured into those bowls, and then it went out to something called shitin. Shemen, however, kedivrei Rabbi Tarfon leishim. So whereas the yayin didn't go on the fire, it went into the sfolim. By contrast, shemen, according to Rabbi Tarfon, would go into the ishim, onto the fire itself. And it becomes like a akrova unto itself. My love, shouldn't we assume from this brisa that midi yayin kula l'sfolim, shemen kula ishim? If you're vacillating back and forth as to whether or not Rabbi Tarfon requires that all the oil should be poured onto the mizbeach to the ishim, then derive it from a comparison analogy to yayin. Just like in the case of yayin, all of the yayin is poured into the sfolim, into these bowls. So too, with regard to shemen, all of the shemen should be poured onto the eish. So Gemara says, midi ira. Is that really an analogy, a valid proof? It could very well be that although in the case of yayin, all of the yayin, the whole volume of yayin is poured into the sfolim, but in the case of the shemen, that's kid'isa, that's unique unto itself, and there's no equation here between yayin and shemen. Regard to shemen, you only put onto the eish what's called a kometz, right? Because we derive Rabbi Tarfon's halacha of misnadev odom shemen from mincha, and in mincha there's a kometz, a kmitza, right, where the Kohen will scoop up the oil with the fine flour in between his fingers, and that kometz is burnt on the mizbeach. But the shirayim, whatever remains from the kometz of the mincha, that's eaten lezichrei kuna. The Kohanim eat that, and therefore, since the Gemara assumes that Rabbi Tarfon is going to derive his halacha of shemen from mincha, then the analogy here is to mincha. And just like in mincha there's shirayim that's eaten by the Kohen, so too in the case of Lug shemen, if he was misnadev shemen b'fnei atzmo, then he will drink the oil that's left over after the kmitza. Kitanoi, shall we say now? Now, I forgot to mention that everything that we've been discussing here, that only part of the shemen, meaning the kmitza part, is to be burnt on the ishim, that is the shita of Shmuel. So now the Gemara thinks that this machlokes about whether or not we burn all of the shemen or only a kmitza of the shemen is actually machlokes tanoim. And now we quote a Mishnah in Masechta Menachos on Kuf Zayin, and the Mishnah says, "Shemen lo yifchos milog." According to Tanakama, the minimum volume of shemen that's brought on the mizbeach has to be a log, and Rabbi Omer, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says shlosha lugim, nothing less than shlosha lugim will do. And although this is Rebbe's shita with regard to shemen, that you need a minimum of 3 lugim, that's derived from yayin nesech. I'm sorry, from yayin lenisuch, I should say. Let me not call it yayin nesech. Yayin lenisuch, which also requires 3 lugim. And that's also a Gemara in Menachos Daf Kuf Zayin. B'maika miflagi, what lies at the root of this machlokas between Rebbe and the Tanakama as to whether or not a minimum of 3 lugim have to be brought for shemen, no less, or 1 lug is sufficient? Amru Abban Kami to Rav Papa. This question was asked to Rav Papa. Rav Papa now analyzes the machlokas between Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. The machlokas is about the laws of derivation. Don mina, according to one opinion, when you derive B from A, then all the details of that derivation, of that halacha that you derive B from A, apply to B. Umina meaning take that which you saw in the Malamed, in the original case that teaches you, and all those details should be now grafted on to the one from which you derive, one which is derived. And that's one opinion. Another approach to derivations is don mina, right? You derive A from B, but after doing so, uki biasra. Now, after you derive A from B, the details will be determined by A, not by B, even though it was from B that you derived this halacha, but nevertheless, A now stands on its own, and all the details are generated by its own native halacha. Rabbanan Savri, according to Rabbanan, who holds that we're going to derive the concept of a korban shemen b'fnei atzmo from mincha, then it's going to be don mina umina. And therefore, ma mincha misnadvim af shemen misnadiv, umina means ma mincha log shemen af kan log shemen. So the minimum amount of shemen for a mincha is 1 log. And therefore, since we are deriving shemen from mincha, then shemen has to be equal to mincha, and 1 log is sufficient. That's the shita of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan go one step further, and they say, Uma mincha komtza v'shayreya nechalim, af shemen komtza u'shiarav nechalim. Let's, in this don mina umina derivation, we're going to also derive how exactly we do the korban of shemen. We're going to do it exactly the way we do a mincha with kmitza. Again, it's a little bit odd that you could do kmitza with shemen. I don't know exactly why the shemen. Apparently, shemen is a little bit thick. It's not a total liquid, so you can still do kmitza. And once you do kmitza, then whatever is the shirayim that wasn't put on the mizbeach is mutar l'kohen, necholim. Ve'idach, what about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi? Mincha, yes, we're going to derive shemen as a separate independent korban on the ishim from mincha, but it's going to be uki bi asra. Ma mincha misnad from Hashem misnad. So far, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi embraces the shita of the Tanakama, and the equation to mincha is going to teach me that shemen is ba b'fnei atzmo, but uki v'asra. Now we're going to derive and establish the halachas of this carbon of shemen from the inner laws that apply to shemen, not from mincha. Kinisachin. And now we're going to say that the law of shemen is similar to the law of yayin, of niskei yayin. Ma nisachim shloshis lugim. The minimum, and this is undeniable, no debate about this, the minimum amount of yayin that you bring for a nesach is got to be 3 lugim, af shemen sholosh lugim. And how much of the shemen is going to be poured on the ishim? Again, we're going to derive it from nisachim. Ma nisachim kulam l'sfalim, af shemen kula leishim. So the fundamental principle that underlies this Gemara is that oil libations have the same status, and according to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that's true, as wine libations. And just like in the case of yayin, where they poured the entire yayin without leaving any of the 3 lugim of yayin out, they poured it all onto the ishim. But in the case of yayin, they poured it into the sfolim. Shemen doesn't go into the sfolim, but the entire volume of 3 lugim of shemen are burnt on the mizbeach. So the Gemara is not excited about this, and I'll tell you why. Because as a general rule, throughout Shas, we hold don mina umina. And now you're accusing Rabbi Yehuda Nasi of holding don mina vi'uki ba'asra. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye, mincha maisi la Rebbe. If Rebbe agrees fundamentally that the foundation, how should I say, the basic law, the basic halacha of shemen is derived from mincha, then I would assume that kuliyama don mina mina. This is the universally accepted shita about derivations, don mina umina. And therefore, if Rebbe would agree that don mina mina, then we have to come back to home plate and reinterpret Rebbe and try to understand why Rebbe holds that it's not enough to bring one single lug of shemen, whereas in mincha, that's all you need. And number 2, that that the entire volume of shemen has to be put on the ishim, not like a mincha where the shirayim is mutter. Ella. So let's now suggest an alternative approach to explain Rebbe Shita, which has nothing to do with do mina mina, but rather Rebbe me ezrach gomerle. So in the parsha, in Bamidbar Tesvav, we have a pasuk that says ezrach. And the word ezrach apparently indicates that you could bring shemen on the mizbeach, because the word ezrach is superfluous, it's not necessary. And in the footnote here, he says that even if Rebbe maintains the principle of don mina umina, he nevertheless came to the conclusion that oil has to be a minimum of 3 lugim because of the equation to a wine libation, to yayin nesech, yayin shenis nasech. And therefore it comes out that according to Rav Papa, it's not really so, as Shmuel would have it, that Machlokes Rebbe and the Tanakama is identical or analogous to the Machlokes Shin Shmuel and those who disagree with Shmuel. Because Shmuel was basing the Machlokes on whether we equated to mincha based on don mina, Whereas now we're saying it's based on the word Ezra. Amalei Rav Papa, Breder Rav Nosson Rav Papa, Amalei Rav Huna, Breder Rav Papa, Breder Nosson Rav Papa, Mi Motzes Amrit Hachi. Can you possibly tell me that Rebbe derives the fundamental possibility of donating oil as a separate carbon on the Eish from the word Ezra? For Asanya, we have a brisa that says, now this brisa, as we'll soon see, is authored by Rabbi Yudah Nasi, Karban Mincha. The pasuk says Karban Mincha, Malamed Shemisnadvim Shemen. Okay, so that's universally accepted by both Rebbe and Rabbi Yudah Nasi, by both Tanakama and Rabbi Yudah Nasi. But Kama, now we're talking in the name of Rebbe, Shlosha Lugim. Because Rebbe accepts the analogy to Yayin Shenis Nasech, which requires a minimum of Shlosha Lugim, Uman Shamet Leiti Omar Shlosha Lugim. Now this derivation that the carbon of Shemen, like Yayin Shenis Nasech, requires a minimum of 3 Lugim, that's Rebbe sheet. Rebbe he become Maisi Leimi carbon, and yet Rebbe in this brisa is deriving his conclusion about the possibility of bringing shemen on the mizbeach as a separate carbon from the word carbon mincha. And if you're deriving it from carbon mincha, and Rebbe agrees to the principle of don mina u mina, then how could Rebbe say that you need 3 lugim and that you just bring the komets, the kmitza of the shemen, and the shirayim are eaten by the kohen? Omalei. So Papa now backs off. And this is very interesting. He says, Tanya Tanya. You know what? If you have such a brisa, then I got to retract my statement. I never knew about this brisa. The brises were not always popularized at that time. So now we have from Rav Papa a retraction in deference to this brisa. So the bottom line now is that once we refute Rav Papa, then the original explanation of don minah uminah dum minah ukibiasra goes back into restoration, and therefore Shmuel's rule that only a kometz from the oil is burnt on the mizbeach is in fact a subject of a machlokas tanoi. Omer Shmuel hamisnadev yayin mevi mazalf al gabi. If a person voluntarily commits himself to bring yayin as a separate nisuch al gabi mizbeach, then it's got to be poured on the fire. And we'll see that that's a problem. My timer, it's not poured into the sfolim, which take it down to the shitin, but rather, according to Shmuel, onto the eish directly. Omar Kra, because the pasuk says, v'yayin takriv l'nesech chatziahin Ishay reach nichoach lashem. So what do we derive from this pasuk? The pasuk is speaking about yayin shenis nasich, a wine libation. And the pasuk calls it Ishay reich nichoach lashem. Ishay means a fire offering. The wine is poured directly onto the fire. And that's exactly what Shmuel says. Hamisnadev yayin, mevi mezalcho, directly pouring it onto the ishim, onto the fire, because the Torah calls it ishe, which means a fire offering. Now, although we don't know when we see this pasuk exactly what the case is, what kind of wine offering is the subject of this pasuk, but we have no choice but to assume that this is donated wine. This is not the wine of yayin shenis nasech as an accompaniment to another carbon, but rather it's yayin b'fnei atzmo. And why is that so? Because if it was meant to accompany another carbon, then you have to allow to accumulate to the point that the mizbeach is full and overflowing with them. And this is a process by which they plugged up the shisim, the holes on top of the mizbeach, into which the wine was emptied from the sfolim, and the wine would completely fill the sfolim. Wine libations that serve as fire offerings, ishe, are another kind of wine libation. These are the donated wine-only offerings that are not meant to accompany a korban. So now we get to a big sugya. And this sugya is based on a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Vav. The Ramban has a lot to say there about this pasuk. And the Torah says, Lo sechabe, you're not allowed to extinguish the fire on the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach has to have a marocha, an eish that's 24/7. How can you tell me that according to Shmuel, you pour the nidava of yain directly onto the eish? Inevitably, you're going to be extinguishing the fire. The Torah says you're not allowed to extinguish the fire. So where it says kibu mixes lo shmei kibu, he's going to pour the yain very slowly, and there won't be any single moment in which he totally extinguishes the eish on the mizbeach. Just that every little drop of yayin will somehow create a certain part of extinguishing, which is called kibui b'miktzas, and that's not what the Torah prohibited. When the Torah says lo sechab, it means don't entirely extinguish the fire. Adi, is this really Sova Omar? Rav Nachman Rabbah, some hamorid gachels melgabe mizbeach v'kibu chayev. If a person takes one single coal from the mizbeach and he extinguishes it, he's chayev malchus. He gets malchus for that, meaning he violated the lo sechaba, even though the fire is still going. This is kibui b'miktzas. So you see clearly that kibui mixes shmei kibui. And the Gemara answers the leka elahai. First answer is that there's only one coal on the Mizbeach. So the Gemara is saying that the statement of Rabbah was not intended to tell you that he took one coal, but he left the other coals, but rather he took the one single coal, and therefore he's chayav. He put out the fire. Iboy, same another answer. Kivoy the mitzvah shiny. Okay. Now, kibui de mitzvah shiny can be translated literally, but it might mean a heck of a lot more. If we translate it literally, then we're dealing with something which is called ese docha losase. That if a person is misnadev yayin, he has a mitzvah say to pour the yayin directly onto the fire. And if he does so, he'll violate the law of lo sechab. And we're not talking about kibui miktzas, but rather we're talking about total kibui. But nevertheless, it's mutter because he's fulfilling his mitzvah. And that's called ese docha losas. The esse overrides the losas. The other way of learning this Gemara, which is much more profound, is kibui b'mitzvah was never prohibited. It's a totally different kibui. It's, again, conceptually, not in reality, not in metzius, but conceptually, it's considered an entirely different act of kibui. And the reason for that is that the Torah prohibits any lav, any isur in the Torah, when you have intention to violate that lav. And that's the sheet of Rabbi Shimon against Rabbi Yehuda, that davar she'eino miskaven mutter. So here what the Gemara is pointing out is that since his intention is not to extinguish the fire, but rather to fulfill his obligation, his mitzvah of ziluf yayin, therefore, that's not what the Torah prohibited. Because that kind of a ziluf is completely excluded from any sort of kavanah. He has no kavanah whatsoever to violate the law. Toshma, The Gemara now doesn't like this answer of Kibu mitzvah shiny, the Tana Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Klape Shenasna Torah Litrom. So this is called Trumas Hadeshen, which means that the Kohen is obligated to separate and remove the ashes from the Mizbeach. But now some of the ashes are still alive. Is Yachol Yechabe v'Yitrom? I might think that in order to perform the Trumas Halishka, the Haramat Trumas Hadeshen, he's got to first extinguish the fire. Otherwise, he'll burn himself. So therefore, the Havamina here, right, in this particular brisa, is that you're allowed to extinguish the fire in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Haramas Hadeshen. But the maskana, the final conclusion is Amrit Lo Yechab. The Torah says not to extinguish it. So we see clearly from this brisa that even though his motivation to extinguish the fire is in order to remove the ashes, which is a mitzvah of Haramas Hadeshen, nevertheless it's prohibited because the Torah says Lo Yichba. And he says Shani Chosam Efshad Yosef V'Notar. That's a different case because he doesn't have to run and jump urgently to remove the ashes. He could wait. He could wait a while. Excuse me. If he waits 10 minutes, then the ashes will be extinguished. But in a case where the Torah requires of you to bring your hisnadvus of yayin beziluf directly to pour it on the ash, then there's no other possibility. You can't wait till the ash is extinguished. Toshma, once again, the Gemara is going to challenge Shmuel. Yayin, we had a brisa, Yayin Kedivra Rabbi Kiva. Shemen, like Lusfolim. Shemen Kedivre Rabbi Tarfon Leishim. So what happens? We take, according to Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon agrees in the case of Yayin, we take all the yayin, pour it on into the bowls, into the sfolim, and it's going directly into the sfolim. That's not Shmuel. Shmuel was the one who said that you take the yayin and you pour it onto the aish. Here it says you pour it into the sfolim. Yayin kedir Rabbi Kiva was sfolim. The Odin, furthermore, another objection to Shmuel. Tanya, we have a brayso that says Yayin Nesech Lisfolim, that the Yayin is not poured on the Aish, but rather into the Sfolim. Oh, anyway, Elishma might think in the Hamamina that it goes on to the Aish, like Shmuel says. Amrit Lo Yichva, the Torah says you're not allowed to do it because you're extinguishing the fire. Lokash. Harab Yehuda v'Harab Shimon. As we mentioned before, there's a universal machlokas all over Shas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. It's not relevant only here to the case of Ziluf Yayin al Gabi Yishim, but the question is, what's the status of a Dover Sheina Miskaven? Like, let's say, for example, you are dragging on Shabbos heavy benches, and the ground is very wet, and you're making furrows in the ground, which is called the Meleches Charishu, because the heaviness of the couch that you're dragging. And Reb Shimon says it's mutter, because Reb Shimon says you have no intention to create these furrows, and therefore the Meleches Chafir was done without kavana. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says no, that even though you're not miskavin, but the action speaks louder than words, and the action itself is an action of chafira. So now, where do we pour the wine? According to Rabbi Yehuda, we have to pour the wine, like Rabbi Kiva said, into the sfolim. Why? Because if you pour it directly onto the ishim, even though it's Eina Miskaven, you're going to be chayv. According to Rabbi Shimon, you pour it directly onto the wine. And since you're not Miskaven, for kibui, it's called a Dover Sheina Miskaven. So Gemara says, wait a minute, L'meimer Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Svirle? You therefore going to drive the conclusion, you have no choice, that Rabbi Shimon, who says that the yayin that he's misnad have to be poured directly onto the wine, he holds like Rabbi Shimon that Dover Sheina Miskaven is mutar. V'amar Shmuel in Masechta Shabbos is committed to Rabbi Yehuda, because he says Mechavin Gachel Shel Mateches B'Shus Rabim B'Shvil Shelo Yizoku Barabim. Now the real Meleches Havara and Kibui, which two sides of one coin, applies only in eights, in wood, not in metal. So the Rabbanan prohibited Kibui in Mateches. But if it's in Rishus Harabim, people are going by and there's blazing hot, burning hot metal on the ground, then people might get injured. And therefore, he allows you to extinguish the fire. But the implication here is, and here we turn to the Tzadi Beis, Avolo Gachel Shalates. If it was the real McCoy Kibui, namely a Gachelis of eights, which the Torah prohibits under the Malach of Kibui, it's one of the 39 Malachas, is that you're not allowed to put out. I guess the element of danger here is somewhat, it's less than Pikuach Nefesh. If Shmuel held and he accepted the position that Dovashen Miskamin is mutter like Reb Shimon, then why shouldn't he be able to put out the Gachela Shel Eitz? Even in the case of Gachela Shel Eitz, he's not Miskamin for Kibui, he's just trying to get the people protection. Now, at this point in the sugya, we get really, really deep into Shabbos, into Melecha Shabbos. Because when he puts out the Gacheles, in this case Shalates, his intention is to extinguish the Gacheles. This is not a Dover Shein Miskavin. This depends on a different machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda is always the machmer, Rabbi Shimon always the mekil, and that's Malach Shen Tzricha Legufa. Meaning that the purpose of kibui is to get the ashes, or to get the wicks. But here he's not interested in the ashes or the wicks. He just wants to put out this dangerous fire. But Dover Shein Miskaven Soverla Kirab Shimon. Shmuel accepts Reb Shimon that Dover Shein Miskaven is mutter, and therefore he holds that you're allowed to pour the wine, and you're obligated to pour the wine directly onto the ishim, and even though you'll be violating kibui, but nevertheless you're doing it shalom b'miskaven, and that's mutter. But b'malacha shein tzricha legufa savar like Reb Yehuda. It's not haba hatalia; they're not interdependent. But you could hold that that Dover Shein Miskaven is mutter, but at the same time malacha shein tzricha legufa is chai. And perhaps the reason for that is because Dover Shein Miskaven is a universal halacha that applies to all isurim, whereas Malach Shein Tzrich Legufa is a specific principle that only applies to Shabbos. And the question is whether or not it's missing, it's lacking in what's called Meleches Machshavos, so it's not lacking Meleches Machshavos. Meaning, although it's true that he doesn't need the pecham, he doesn't need the ashes, but he definitely wants to put out the fire. Amar Rav Huna, Nisachim shenitmu osem lahem marocha b'fnei atzma v'sarfin. That's normally you would have said that something becomes tamei, then take it out of the azara and burn it way out there. No, Rav Huna says that in the case of the Nisachim, if they become tamei, you've got to burn them inside the azara. Why? Mishum shenemar ba'kodesh ba'esh tisarif. The Torah is saying that this yayin that became tamei, yayin is nasech, be'esh tisarif, and it says ba'kodesh. Ba'kodesh means in the azor. Tanya nami hochi, and we have a brisa, hadam, v'ashemen, v'amenachos, v'nesachim shenitmu, osel ma'arocha b'fnei atzma v'sorfon, and you have to burn them in the azor. Amalei Shmuel Rabbi. I see libei, so I want to publicize this halacha. Gather me together 10 people. And I will say in your presence, now we begin a new chapter on Daf Tzadi Beis Amud Aleph.